We're talking about the state of the federal government's finances. The session is led by Professor Michael Granof. Dr. Granof has been at the university since 1972. In that time, he's gained a reputation as a wonderful teacher, but he's also served in many roles in the university. He's been the department chair. He teaches at the LBJ School. He's currently president of the University Co-ops Board. He's an expert in the area of governmental accounting, and you will see that expertise in this session. Welcome.
Well, thank you, and it's really an honor and a privilege for me to be here. What I'd like to do today is to talk a little bit about the problem that we're facing. The title is Living Rich, Retiring Poor. I'm actually going to focus on the latter part, retiring poor. I decided on this topic a couple of months ago, and you always get a little bit nervous when you decide on a topic a couple of months ago. But then just yesterday it happened that I got this email from the Center of Retirement, the Retirement Center at Boston University, and they're really excellent. And listen to what they said in this email. They said the campaign discourse misses the major issue. Retirement income security is receiving little attention as the presidential campaign heats up, despite amount of evidence that American retirement prospects are stagnating or worse. And they point out that Medicare has been the center of the debate, but there really hasn't been much discussion of the much broader topics, the problems of income security. But then they go on. In the retirement community, however, debate swirls constantly about how bad the situation really is. And these debates are slicing the onion awfully thin when one research paper or report after another contains a new aspect of the troubling fallout from the final years of transition from secure employment-guaranteed pensions, that is, defined benefit pensions, to DIY, by do-it-yourself retirement. And sometimes it seems that Wall Street's collapse of 2008 was just the kickoff. And it goes on to add some other sobering findings. Only 52% now think that they'll have enough money to retire on, down considerably from past years. Half of the elderly living alone, and 1/3 of couples having less than $10,000 to live on. And the point is that this is exactly what motivated my thinking. And the key points that I'm going to make today, this is sort of like the summary of what I'm going to say, is owing to the federal financial situation today, both Social Security and Medicare are likely to decrease. That's not to say they're going to go away, but at least in real terms, you're going to get less Social Security and health care costs are going to go up. Defined contribution plans are now virtually ubiquitous, but the fact of the matter is they've been a failed experiment. They just simply haven't worked, and I want to talk about that. Corporate pension plans today are significantly underfunded. When I say corporate pension plans, I mean defined benefit plans. For those few who have them, they are significantly underfunded. And of course, public pension plans are an absolute disaster. And what I want to talk about, if we have time, is the new GASB pronouncements. I'm a member of the GASB board. I want to talk about the new pension rules, which will in fact make, when people realize what happens, what the impact of those rules are going to be, then you're really going to see how bad public pensions in fact are. So, but what are some of the sort of the overall problems that we face, the overall trends? Well, first of all, we're living a lot longer. In 1983, the average life expectancy for somebody who was 65 years old was for a male, was 15.1 years. Now, in this short time, it's increased by 3 years. And of course, something comparable has happened with women. Clearly, we've all talked about the baby boomers retiring. Well, let's look at a measure of that. In 2011, today, there are 35 Social Security beneficiaries for each 100 covered workers. In other words, each worker today supports another third of a retiree. But by But by 2030, that's going to increase substantially to 47 beneficiaries for every 100 workers. You can imagine the drain on the economy that that's going to produce. Then, of course, at the same time, we all know what the trend in interest rates are. You have your savings, your 401k plans. They're not earning very much. In fact, today, I mean, look at the trend in earnings in interest rates from 1983 down to today, and you'll notice today it's negative. So we are getting a negative return on your investments today. Then, of course, we know that the long-term outlook for the economy is bleak. And we'll talk a little bit about the federal government, but then note that state and local governments are in even worse shape. And they are in no position to compensate for the sad fiscal state of the federal government. If the federal government, first of all, the federal government may cut back on its own programs, and that will force costs down to the states. And then, of course, the states are directly dependent upon an enormous amount of direct federal aid. That's not going to increase in the future. Then, of course, retirees tend to have a substantial portion of their wealth tied up in their homes, and we see that housing values are down considerably. Well, let's take a look. Let's start at the level of the federal government, and let's see what position they are in. Now, this is drawn, this balance sheet is drawn from the financial statements of the federal government. And believe it or not, the federal government does produce an annual financial report. And I have here the sort of the abbreviated version of the financial report. I urge you to take it as you leave. It's fascinating. And let me just say that that financial report, unlike the budget, you can take that seriously. It's based on rather, I'd say very conservative financial principles. It's based on, they're accrual-based statements. This is not, and they're audited. They're audited by, the various agencies are audited either by the GAO or independent CPAs, and the complete financial report is audited by the GAO. This is completely unlike the budget. The budget is fiction. This is reality. So what do we notice? I don't know if you can read this, but the point is this, that if you look at the bottom line down here, you'll see net position $14.8 trillion. That's negative net position, $14.8 trillion. If you look at just the debt held by the public, that is $10.1 trillion. That's debt held by the public. The difference between total debt and debt held by the public is that the various trust funds, like the Social Security Trust Fund, hold substantial amount of federal securities. But these liabilities exclude what? They exclude the big elephant, and that's social insurance. So if you were going to include social insurance, that magnifies the debt considerably. Now, why isn't Social Security included as a liability? The reason is when the Financial Accounting Standards Advisory Board, and I'm a member of that right now, when that board considered that they considered putting Social Security on the financial statements, booking it as a liability. Well, the fact of the matter is that the FASAB has four representatives. Now they have three. They used to have four representatives from the federal government, and two of those entities have veto power. The administration at that time, refused to put it on the balance sheet. But they did eventually get a compromise. And the compromise was you don't book the liability on the balance sheet. However, right next to the balance sheet, right following it, is this statement of social insurance. And this sets forth the liability, and it's a reasonable compromise, because anybody who can add can figure out what the total liability is. Now, let's look at what we have over here. this is based on 75-year projection. And for Social Security itself, I guess you can't read this, but it's something like 9.157. For hospital insurance, it's considerably larger, it's less, it's 3.2. That's Medicare Part A. For Medicare Part B, it's 13 trillion. Then you have some others. You have Medicare Part D, which is not being adequately funded. And then you have miscellaneous things, railroad retirement and black lung disease. They're rather minor. Now, we come to the total. And there are two ways to view the total. One is what they call an open group method. The other is a closed group method. You can take your pick. I'm not going to go into the details of it. But the point is, if you use the closed group method, that adds another $45 trillion to the deficit. The open group method adds only something like $33 trillion. In any event, you're talking about real money. Now, the other thing that's interesting, I point this out just as an aside. If you could read these numbers, and they're in they should be in there somewhere. What's interesting is from 2010 to 2011, it looks as if the liability has decreased. That's not reality. The reason it decreased is this. These projections have to be based on current law. That's the way the standard is written. It has to be based on current law. Well, nobody believes that current law is reality. Current law, under the Obamacare, whatever you want to call it, the projections are that certain payments to physicians will actually decline. Well, nobody believes that. When I say nobody, I don't just mean a few right-wing Republicans. I mean the trustees of Social Security say that that's unbelievable, and therefore the auditors of this statement say this is unbelievable, and that's one of the reasons why they qualify their opinion on this particular statement. Well, that's the liability. Where does the money go today? Well, if you look at this, almost all of it goes to non-discretionary, for non-discretionary purposes. Health and Human Services, 24%, Social Security, Defense. Veterans Affairs, that's largely pensions and interest. So we're left with 23% is discretionary. If you look at this statement, again, I'm sorry that's not too clear, indicates that indicates more specifically where the money goes. All right, so what do we have? The big items, as shown before, are human services, Social Security, and defense, and then interest. All right, fine. So in other words, what's this saying? Where can you save money? Let's go down a bit. Let's suppose, for example, that you don't like foreign aid. You think we give too much to Israel, too much to Egypt, whatever. Fine. Cut out the entire Department of State, and you're going to save 0.6% of the budget. You don't like the Department of Education, as our governor doesn't like it? Fine. Cut it out. You know what you're saving then? 1.5% of the budget. You don't like the National Science Foundation, because they fund all these cockamamie studies about the sex life of tortoises? Fine. Reduce the entire National Science Foundation 0.19%. So that's the problem that we face. Now, let's look at the trends. First, this black line up here, that's the projections of revenue. The others are the expenses. Now, first, let me just note something. Back here, of course, is the actual results. What we find, what I find is interesting, of course, here is the recession. But notice, we not only have a spike in spending, at the same time, we've had a considerable drop in revenue. So the problem that we're facing today, in other words, the cause of this huge deficit, is partly increase in spending, TARP and bailouts, the stimulus, but also, of course, a reduction in revenue. Now, these are the trends. So what do we notice? That we're facing a deficit for the foreseeable future. It's kind of constant. So you look at this and you say, well, that's not so bad. Project out under current law, and we're doing okay. The deficit is kind of constant. But what's the big problem? As you're increasing the deficit, how do you fund that? You have to fund that by borrowing, right? So let's look at what happens now. That chart, by the way, I should have noted, did not include interest. That was just a primary deficit. Now you add an interest, and what do you get? Now all of a sudden, look at the trends. This is the gap, which is increasing, and notice that's a percentage of GDP. So what are we looking at? We're looking at 40%, 38% of GDP projected out. Clearly, that is not sustainable. All right, let's get then into Social Security. Now, what do we notice about Social Security? Again, here we have the income. Under this line is the income, the revenues that are being taken in, payroll taxes. This line is the expenses. Now, up until 2011, up until then, Social Security took in more than it paid out. In other words, it was increasing its surplus. Now, it's just the opposite. Now, we're paying out more than we're taking in. Therefore, the Social Security Trust Fund is now being depleted year by year. And what's going to happen? It's going to run out by 2036. Now, the question is that a big deal? And the answer is probably not. Because what's happening right now? There is this Social Security Trust Fund. But what's in that trust fund? It's all U.S. government bonds. In other words, so what happens? Now that we're withdrawing from the trust fund, where the Social Security Trust Fund, is redeeming those bonds, and therefore, how does the government redeem those bonds? Either has to raise taxes or issue more debt. So in other words, Social Security now, at least the deficit is being funded by traditional government borrowing or taxes. Yes?
So, is there another way to redeem bonds is what we're doing currently, which is, in effect, printing more money.
Oh, that's another.
The Federal Reserve is just, we issue bonds, the Federal Reserve buys bonds. The bonds, that's the equivalent of just printing more paper.
Yes, that's correct.
And so it seems to me that the real tax, this is actually Bloomberg. I was listening to Bloomberg radio on the way in this morning, and the expert they were talking to was sort of also making this point, which I always thought was the case, is that the hidden tax here is basically on all of our bonds and equities, all of our securities, all of the money we put away for retirement, because we're going to get 100% the value of the dollar 15 years from now will be worth half of what it's worth today, and our savings are going to be worth a hell of a lot less than they are today, unless the stock market.
I told you I'm not here to cheer you up. All right. So we go to Medicare Part A, and you got exactly the same sort of problem. There, that is funded by a trust fund, and indeed, that's going to run out in 2024. So again, that's going to have to be dealt with. Then, we could go to Medicare Part B and Part D. Those are not funded by trust funds, but notice what we get. Those are funded by premiums of one sort or another. And once again, we have a revenue line over here and an expenditure line over here. Once again, the outlook is not very promising. And you can look at this another way as a percentage of GDP. This is the amount. You're talking about, or 3-4% is going to have to be funded. 3-4% of GDP is going to have to be used just to fund Medicare Part B and Part D. Now, what's the problem here? First, we see that healthcare costs, Medicare Part B, as a percentage of average Social Security benefit, has increased tremendously. In other words, as I'll note in a couple of minutes, most people are going to have to rely on Social Security for their retirement. And what's happening? Medicare, healthcare costs are going to eat into that. So in other words, effectively, the money available, the discretionary spending out of Social Security is going to be reduced tremendously. Now, what's the problem? Is Social Security really a major problem? Can that be solved readily? In other words, if you want to keep that in balance, of course. It's relatively easy to do that. You can raise the cap. Today it's $106,000. Good, increase that to something higher. And you've enhanced revenues immeasurably. You can raise the retirement age. There are things you can do. We tried reforming Social Security. I'm not going to comment on whether we did it the right way or not, but the point is there wasn't the political will to change Social Security, to reform it. Social Security is not the big problem. Medicare, healthcare costs are the real problem. Look, we can cut Medicare payments, no question about it. Easy to do. But what happens then? Then the costs simply get shifted down to the state and local governments, and they get shifted from the state and local governments down to the emergency rooms. If we're going to solving the Medicare problem in a meaningful, real way means what? Figuring out how to reduce health care costs while maintaining a high level of health care. That's the challenge. And so far, at least, we in the United States either don't have a clue how to do that or are unwilling to take the steps to do it. But that is the real challenge. It's not Social Security. Now, that's fine. But Social Security, reliance on the federal government, is one source of income. What's happening with workers? Well, the white line over here represents what happened in 1983. In 1983, something like 63% of workers who had pension coverage, these are workers who were covered in some way, had defined benefit plans. Today, that number, somehow the colors didn't come out properly. That number today has dropped down to here, considerably less, around 15 or 16%. Conversely, there's been a shift. Today, very few workers have defined benefit plans. Almost everyone who has coverage has defined contribution plans, and a few people have both. But most workers don't have even any sort of pension, defined benefit or defined contribution. This is 2008 data. 31% participated only in a 401k plan. 3% participated only in a defined benefit plan. 12% participated in both types. In other words, that's 34, about 45% of people had any sort of pension plan. And obviously, you're talking about higher earning workers who have those plans. I saw data the other day, and these they were down slightly from these numbers. These numbers aren't perfectly accurate. These are estimates, but they're pretty close. Obviously, in the public sector, it's a different story. Public sector workers are today covered by mainly not just retirement plans, but for the most part, defined benefit plans. Now, let's look at how much people have in their plans. This is by tenure. So people, let's go out here. People with 30 years work experience. 30 years work experience. Notice now you're talking about people who are pretty darn close to retirement. Look at this. If they're in their 60s, approaching retirement, they have an average of $202,000. Now, somebody who's 65 years old, the average, as we saw, the average life expectancy is another 17 or 18 years. $200,000 does not go very far. But now let's just look at it in terms of salary. Let's first start with the wealthy, those who are earning over $100,000. Now, maybe in this audience, $100,000, we all think of ourselves as middle class. But the reality is, $100,000 earnings probably places you in the top 2 or 3% of the population, pretty close to that. So 100,000 is really, the very rich statistically. And what do they have in their balance? They have something like $300,000 in their 401k plans. Look at people with lesser incomes. Start with people, 20 to 40,000 in their 60s. Maybe have 53,000, 80 to 100,000, who again pretty wealthy, 216,000. Now I don't know how reliable these figures are. I've looked at all sorts of data sources. You get different numbers, but they're all, they all tell pretty much the same story. In other words, people do not have very much in the way of wealth that's supplementing Social Security. Now, for sure, people do have other savings, but the reality is, statistically, it is not very much. Now, what's the problem with these 401k plans? And let's face it, everyone is shifting today to 401k plans. Why do I say that they've been a failed experiment? They've been a failed experiment because people don't have the money. But the fact of the matter is that 401k plans, compared to traditional defined benefit plans, are simply inefficient. Talk to virtually any actuary, and they'll tell you that the best defined contribution plan is less efficient than the worst defined contribution plan. Why is that? Well, just think about this. If you have a defined contribution plan, it's your own plan, and you're 65 years old, the average life expectancy may be 18 or 20 years. That's average. That means, though, that you, if you're fortunate, will live another perhaps 30 years. So you have to put away enough money to assuming that you'll live for another 30 years perhaps. By contrast, if you're in a defined benefit plan, this all averages out. Therefore, you can put aside, collectively, a lot less than under a defined contribution plan. The administrative costs tend to be less in defined benefit plans because they're managed by super professionals. And you have large amounts of money collectively, so you can manage it more efficiently. The problem today, as I said, 60% of low-income workers who are eligible for 401k plans but have to make a contribution themselves choose not to do so. And that's understandable. In today's environment, what do you have? You have people who are earning $30,000, $40,000. That's maybe a family income. How can they afford to put away money into their retirement system? And certainly a 30-year-old, and that's when it matters that you put in money. By the time you're 50 and 60, it's too late. It won't compound. When you're 30 or 40, who thinks about retiring? That's been the major problem. Furthermore, of course, we've seen it's the employees rather than the employers that bear the risks. And we've seen what happens when you have a recession as we're in today. And the reality is that it's been demonstrated that employees are simply not very good at managing their money. So the point is that when we shift from a 401k plan, when we shift from a defined benefit plan to a 401k plan, that's generally speaking, that represents a decrease in overall compensation. All right, let's move on then. What about corporate pension plans? As I say, today, they're not terribly significant. But the reality is, even those plans are underfunded. Per Deutsche Bank data, of the S&P 500 pension plans, the deficit is something like $324 billion, but 2.5% of their market cap. Generally speaking, they are, it says 82% unfunded. That's not correct. That should be they're 82% funded. They're 18% unfunded. And in large measure, it turns out, one of the reasons why they're unfunded is they've been shifting their asset portfolio into bonds, and bond yields that have been so low in recent years. So let's turn to what's gotten a lot of publicity in recent years, and that's state and local plans. And state and local plans, generally speaking, are a disaster area. For the most part, they are simply not properly funded. 2010, they're on average, the aggregate funding ratio, looking across all state and local governments, they were 75% funded. And that, of course, depends on how you figure the numbers. If you ask certain financial economists, they will say that ratio, that funding ratio, is much too high. I mean, this is really an accounting issue of how you figure out what the unfunded liability is. The if you look at state by state, you see that some states are really in serious condition. Illinois, of course, is the basket case of the pension world. They're 46% funded. Rhode Island and Connecticut are pretty poor. West Virginia is poor. Texas is not pretty. Texas is in very good shape, as a matter of fact. We're 82% funded, which is not bad at all. Surprisingly, New York is overfunded, and that's because by law they have to be funded. But I mean, the problem is we've got this shortfall, and how are we going to make it up? Truth is that, at least in today's environment, most states are facing shortfalls in the future, so they can't very well suddenly start funding their pensions. What are states doing? What are cities doing? Well, some of them are borrowing money. In other words, they're issuing pension bonds. Pension bonds, the truth is a terrible idea. What's a pension bond? New Jersey went into this a few years ago. In other words, they issued bonds, let's say, that at that time they were required to pay interest at a rate of 6%. And they put that money in the pension fund, hoping, of course, that they could expecting to earn far more than 6%. Well, in the case of New Jersey and many other municipal governments, it just simply didn't work out that way. Now New Jersey, under Governor Christie, has a new idea. He's simply not putting any money into the pension fund, and that's how he's balancing his budget. Now, pensions, of course, are only one part of the problem. Pensions, for the most part, are funded. Maybe not as completely as they should, but they are funded. What about what we call OPEB, other post-employment benefits, which is almost entirely health insurance? State and local governments have an obligation for that, but they're not funding that at all, and so that adds, by some measure, another $555 billion to the collective deficits of state and local governments. Now, the truth of the matter is that, there are ways to reform pension plans for governments. And some of these, the ones here, in my opinion, are sort of the low-hanging fruit. What you can do is you can, and we should be doing things like this, eliminate spiking. Spiking is when the pension is based, let's say, on the last year's salary of an employee. So that's why you'll see firemen and police officers and others, all of a sudden, they'll be working 100-hour weeks in their last year of employment, and therefore boosting their pensions, to far, far more than they ever earned in their working years. You can increase the retirement age. What happens today is government employees, let's say they're able to retire after 20 years of service. So let's say they start working at age 25. At age 45, they're retiring, and they're getting their pension at that time, and of course they're free to get other jobs as well. In my opinion, that makes no sense. If you're going to allow retirement after 20 years, and maybe that's legitimate for certain people in certain occupations, firefighters and police officers, fine. But it seems to me they shouldn't be allowed to take their pension until they reach a reasonable retirement age. You should change the formulas to require, maybe more years of service. Require employees to make contributions themselves. In most municipalities, employees do not have to fund their plans at all. Put a cap on eligible income. And this is exactly, by the way, these things are exactly what California has done within the past 10 days or so. Maybe you can convert to hybrid plans, have part defined contribution, part defined benefit. And then, of course, the other thing is we should be changing the eligibility for medical benefits. In many places, if you work 5 years, sometimes 3 years, if you work 3 to 5 years in many jurisdictions, you are now eligible for full medical benefits upon your retirement. And it seems to me that makes no sense at all. You want a longer period. Now, let me just talk about what I've been involved in for probably the last year or two. And that is the new GASB pension rules. Let me tell you this, that when GASB gets through, well, they're sort of partly through with their pension reforms, but when they get through with this, suddenly the liabilities are going to appear far, far greater than they are today. And many governments, they don't know what's going to hit them in the future because they haven't paid attention to these arcane, impenetrable rules. First of all, today, what's shown on a government balance sheet is very little. If a government makes the contributions required by the actuary, even if they're underfunded, as long as they make their annual required contribution, then they would show no liability on their balance sheet. That's going to change. The calculation of the liability is going to be much more rigorous. There's going to be much greater volatility shown. In other words, economic reality is going to be shown. You're not going to be able to amortize various expenses over ridiculously long periods of time. And the one I want to talk about in just a couple of minutes is the impact on cost-sharing employees, or cost-sharing plans. The computation, let me just say that the GASB deals with establishing standards of accounting and reporting. We don't deal with funding rules. So we have nothing to say about how governments actually choose to fund their plans. But what I would note is this, that the approach that the GASB is taking now, which has now just been passed within the last 2 months, is this. From here on in, a government is going to have to report its unfunded liability on its balance sheet. The approach is this, that the thinking is that the employer has a liability to its employees. And that's going to be actuarially computed. That's the total liability. But as long as they have assets in a qualified trust fund, those assets will be netted against the liability, and that is the amount that will be reported on the balance sheet. The approach is similar to a corporation, something that, you know, if you studied accounting, you're familiar with. That is, you project the benefits, you discount them back to the future, and then you spread them over the years of employee service. And that just sort of demonstrates that. But here's the, and this has to be done according to actuarial assumptions, and now we've just limited it to one actuarial method, the entry age method, which is a pretty conservative method. But here's the controversial part. What we're saying is this. GASB has said that for a discount rate, for discounting the liability to the present value, you should use the expected earnings rate as long as there's going to be money in that fund. When the money runs out, and you're going to project out, when that money runs out, then you switch. Then you switch to the borrowing rate, which would be a high-quality, tax-exempt municipal borrowing rate. Now, so in other words, there's going to be some crossover point, and without getting into the technicalities, there's going to be some sort of average rate. Now, this is what's been exceedingly controversial. What the financial economists say is this. They say your rate is far, far too high. They say that the rate that should be used is the risk-free, a risk-free discount rate. The risk-free market rate. Now, what that would mean is if you use a very low market rate, that would increase your liability substantially. They say that, first of all, they say that pensions are basically risk-free, that governments cannot abrogate their pensions. And they say that's a market rate, and that's the way liabilities should be valued. We as accountants don't see it that way. We believe, first of all, that the pensions are not risk-free. Oh, secondly, the financial economists argue, they say that the liability has nothing to do with the assets. That merely because you choose to invest in, let's say, risky investments, that doesn't change the value of your liability. And that makes a lot of sense from their perspective. From an accounting perspective, I don't think it makes very much sense. Because it seems to me that if you have the assets and you're earning that much on your assets, that's an appropriate, that's closely related to the liability. But without going into the details, let me just say this, that this has been extremely controversial. There are a couple of academics at let's see there, Northwestern and Rochester, pretty conservative schools. They have written papers in which they advocate this risk-free rate, and they figured that the total liabilities are far, far greater than others have set them at. Far, far greater than would be reported in the financial statements. They've gotten a lot of publicity about this. Now, let me just say this, that I think they've got a point in this regard. They say that governments are using far too high a rate. They're saying that governments today are using an expected rate of return on investments of 7.75% to 8%, and you can't earn that in the future. They're probably right about that. From my perspective, as a standard setter, I'm saying that's not our problem. That's the auditing problem. You, the auditors, should be taking the governments to task if that rate is too high. And by the way, it is coming down somewhat. The final point that I would make today is this, with respect to cost-sharing plans. A cost-sharing plan is when many governments share in a single plan. You know, the best example of that are school districts throughout the country. School districts, you know, they don't have their own pension plans. Rather, they're in a state plan, you know, like the state of Texas Teachers Retirement Plan. Now, up until now, if they made the contributions that are required of them by the plan, they showed no liability. And their reported expense was just the amount of cash that they paid. The new rules change that. The new rules say they have got to report as their liability their share of the overall pension plan's collective unfunded liability. So they're going from no liability to a very substantial liability, and that hasn't hit them yet. In other words, you've got all these school board trustees who think they've had balanced budgets, who think they have, you know, positive net positions, positive net assets. When the accountants get through with them in another 2 years, when these rules go into effect, suddenly they're going to see that they have huge, huge liabilities. And as you can imagine, they're not going to be, you know, very happy about that. So, what have I tried to say today? That you can still count on your Social Security. It's not going to go away. You know, the naysayers say that people in their 20s don't believe they're going to collect Social Security. They'll collect it, but don't expect any increases, and it may well not keep up with inflation. Your medical costs, paid one way or another, paid through Medicare, paid through state and local government taxes, paid through increased insurance premiums, whatever, they are sure to increase. If you have a 401k plan, you better start putting away the maximum, because if you're like the typical employee, you're not going to have sufficient savings. If you are not among the wealthy, your golden years, you know, may not be so golden. And if you're a public sector employee, then plan on pension reforms, and those are going to be, that's going to represent a decrease in your overall compensation. So my message today hasn't been terribly cheerful, hasn't been terribly optimistic, but I believe that that's reality.